Hi, I'm Sam Brown. It's good to be with you. I'm sorry it's under such strange circumstances, and I'm hopeful that next year things will be calm again and we'll be able to gather together and celebrate. Uh, Nevertheless, here we are back in the land of Zoom, and I want to walk you through the image of the light of Christ in the early revelations of Joseph Smith. And I'm hopeful that this will give us some new insights into the nature of God and gospel, and will be a fun ride. And I think we had to start by just acknowledging the fact that light is uh, is a little bit mysterious, even when the physicists talk about it. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of effort to try to understand what exactly is light. It's something that we intuitively have just realized that it's something that can blind us, and it's something that makes everything else visible. But whether it's a wave, like the waves of the sea, or a particle, like pellets coming from a pellet gun, was not entirely clear. And there were some elegant experiments that were done in the early 20th century that suggested that it might be both. And people talked about the wave particle duality. Some people were skeptical of it. Some people thought it was really quite clear and true. Others have started to say, no, they're all just fields after all. The reason I mention that is to point toward the fact that even some things that we would think are pretty well settled in physics are actually still really interesting. There's a lot we don't understand about light, and when you get working with a physicist to try to just nail down what exactly they mean by matter, things get even more complicated, and they start waving their hands and doing higher maths, and you're left with a sense that they're onto something, but the final word on what light and matter are is something that we're going to be continuing to figure out for some time to come. So as we ponder light from a religious or a spiritual or even a metaphysical perspective, it's worth bearing in mind that even the physics of light are still very complex and interesting, and I think are going to have a lot of new possibilities for us in the future. So I do want to talk about the M word, and it's not the old word we used to refer to the Latter-day Saints, but metaphysics. And that Greek up top is meta ta physika, that which is beside or in addition to physics. And so for the ancient Greeks, physics was everything that the materialists or the atheists would say the world is made out of, and they might say that that's all there is to it. But we would be comfortable with the walls of this house, or the tissues of my body, these little funny earrings I use to talk with you. Those are all matter. Those are concerned with physics, or some people would translate it nature. Then metaphysics is the rest, and it can be a little inelegant, but the idea is that it's what's greater than or more than. I think all of us have had an experience spiritually of acknowledging something greater than ourselves. Well, in some respects, metaphysics is concerned with what's greater than ourselves. And what we ought to acknowledge is that historically, these were complementary halves of a harmonious whole. Physics and metaphysics, you couldn't have one without the other. And an image that I think about is the body. And the body has the bones. I just managed to break my wrist and pinky in a mountain bike accident a couple months ago. I know those bones, but there's also the soft tissues, and the soft tissues are our skin and our muscles and our organs and our brains. And there's been a sense in which, in the last maybe 200 or 300 years, with intensification over the last half century, people, activists of a certain stripe, that are really a return to the Epicurean philosophy of pagan antiquity, have been trying to argue that you can extract the metaphysics, leave the physics on its own, and all is well. As if you're restoring an old painting by getting rid of all the accretions of the centuries, and there's the original painting finally able to shine forth, stripped of religion or spirituality. But I think the more accurate analogy is that trying to separate metaphysics and physics is like trying to take a body and removing all of the bones from it so you can get to the true soft tissues. And you get an image of wet, wobbly death rather than of something liberated from its bondage. So as we're talking about metaphysics, I want you to have an automatic kind of response that says that physics without metaphysics is like a body without a skeleton. And I think that image will be helpful for us as we start to think a little bit more about the light of Christ and about the revelations. There's one other moment just to pause, and that's Blaise Pascal. He was an important French philosopher and theologian. People know him now from this story about making the bet on God, although that's a little more complicated story than it's usually allowed to be. Here I want to talk about his creed. He had a personal creed that was actually sewn into his coat, a little bit like almost like a tattoo would be now. But back then, tattooing was not something Europeans especially did. That creed had him praying to what he called the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, that many people call the God of the Bible. That's a personal, involved, embodied God who was passionate and loyal and committed to these people, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and so on. And he contrasted that in his creed to the God of the philosophers, which was perfect, remote, logical, and impersonal. And he sort of contrasted the lived experience of him as a believer, worshiping the God of the Bible, with the attempts by philosophers, and in fact, many of his peer philosophers, to think through the perfect logic of a God. And that distinction between the God of the Bible and the God of philosophers is going to be important to us as we move along. And then there's this question that is being discussed again after a period of time when it wasn't, which is whether Latter-day Saints are materialists, i.e., they believe that there is only physics and there is no metaphysics, in one translation of it. And there, of course, is the revelation in section 131 that says there is no such thing as immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but it is more fine or pure. And many thinkers over the years have believed that the restoration gospel is, in fact, materialist on those grounds. And I think there's something, clearly this is a revelation and we accept and honor it as quite true. The question is whether we've been interpreting it wholly correctly. Another revelation, this one not canonized, but it's one that's very familiar to us. That's from the General Conference sermon that Joseph Smith preached in April 1844. And he indicated that the sermon was inspired by the recent death of his friend, Elder King Follett. King was his first name. Died building a well in Nauvoo. Some rocks fell on him. It's a rough time to be alive. And in that General Conference talk, was often called the King Follett Sermon or King Follett Discourse, he says that we believe in the great Elohim, that's the Father of Jesus, who sits enthroned in yonder heavens. And in other parts of that General Conference talk, he describes something, he describes a way of understanding God that sounds a lot like Pascal's God of the Bible. Earthy, material, accessible, someone who could be touched, someone who could be emulated, someone who has a body of flesh and bones. And those two, revelations and discourses have been used really since the 1840s, even a little bit in the late 1830s, to think about this idea that the Latter-day Saints are strict materialists. And I've come to think that's probably not an accurate interpretation of these texts. And I'm trying to be cooler than I am. TLDR means too long didn't read. So if you don't want to delve into it, not really. The Latter-day Saints are not really strict materialists. If you want the longer story, and others have trod this ground before me, just have been a little bit of a minority voice over the years, but I think it's worth bringing into focus. If you were to talk to a materialist, and the new atheist entertainers, the guys that have the big YouTube followings and write the splashy books about how stupid religious people are, if you take them as a gauge of materialists, and admittedly many philosophers do not think they're accurate representatives, they're entertainers rather than rigorous thinkers when it comes to questions of life and death and religion and science. But at some level, they represent a basic philosophy that really is this return to Epicurean pagan religion, which says there is nothing but physics, there is nothing but matter. And by that, they mean there's nothing that religious people talk about as the greater than. And if you were to go up to one of these new atheist entertainers or one of these really assiduous materialists and say, hey, by the way, turns out the Latter-day Saints are materialists too, their jaws would drop. They really have no sense of kinship with restoration gospel. And it's important to understand what materialism as it's taught is really trying to do. And that's to break out heaven and earth, like I talked about, to extract the skeleton from a body. And that skeleton, the metaphysics, is that heaven, remove it and put it as far away as you can. And for some of them, they put it far enough away that they don't have to bother about it, but heaven or God or metaphysics is still real, but it just is untethered from us. And others go all the way and say, no, there is no other world. There is no heaven. There is no metaphysics. There is no skeleton for this body. And at some level, if you step back and just watch what it's doing in the world, the philosophy of materialism is protecting ourselves from heaven by banishing it. It's a kind of fear rather than liberation. And it's one that is totally alien to the restoration gospel. On the contrary, Joseph Smith and others are welcoming the other world into an intimate community with ours. And the restoration is fundamentally what I believe is a deeply Christian and Jewish story brought into much clearer focus in the restoration. That heaven and earth, again, are complements, like physics and metaphysics. They're complements, like the skeleton and the soft tissues of a body. They live together. And the restoration calling is to bring matter, both pure and coarse, both metaphysical and physical, to transform the cosmos. That's what we're called to do. And that's really the opposite of philosophical materialism. And that's why I think it's worth bearing in mind that that's not what we're about. So what I'd like to do in the rest of the talk is shine a light. And I love the Hubble telescope. It's so just beautiful, the images they get from it. But I'd like to shine a more careful light into the question of materialism and start by wondering, what is the divine light? Excuse me, that's allergies, which I've had for many years rather than COVID. So the question is, what is divine light? And we've historically talked about it as the light of Christ, but there's more going on here, as we'll be exploring. Is it just our conscience that we have that we're born with? Is it, on the contrary, an essence or force that permeates the entire universe? Is it kind of the fabric of metaphysics? Is it the moral rules about the universe, the shoulds or the oughts that describe the universe rather than the whats, the whys rather than the whats of the universe? Is it just a synonym, another name for the spirit or the other comforter? Or perhaps, and we'll talk about this at the end, is it a way of talking about a priesthood of the cosmos? And I think the reality is it's probably some of all of them. But now it's time for us to engage the restoration revelations of St. John, or of John the Evangelist. And start with the revelations of John. The first chapter, basically the first 18 verses of the first chapter, are the Prologue of John. And for every student of New Testament Greek, it is that first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, or God was the Word, are the ones that the early students commit to memory, right? That anarche and hologos. That's what everybody knows. And it's so familiar that I think we sometimes sort of stumble on through it. One thing that's important to remember about this Prologue of John is that first word, in the beginning, anarche, that is precisely that's precisely the first two words of the Septuagint. Remember, the Septuagint is the Greek Bible that was translated from Biblical Hebrew that many Jews no longer understood into Greek, which was the language of the kingdom that they understood at the time. And so it was the major version of the Old Testament that was available in Jesus's time to people. So when you read the New Testament and you see that it's engaging the Old Testament, most of the time it's actually interacting with the Septuagint, the Greek scriptures. So what John is saying at the beginning of this prologue is, I've got another story about Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And remember how much Joseph Smith loves Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It's not a shock that he's also deeply committed to John chapter 1, verse 1. And what's important to note about the prologue is that this word that is with God, the Logos that's with God, is a familiar ancient Jewish Hebrew notion of the Memra YHWH, or Memra Yahweh, the Word of God. And it's a sense that there was an entity that existed in harmony with God, that was a mechanism by which God made God's influence felt on the world. There was a sense of a co-creative capacity. And we as Latter-day Saints are very familiar with this notion of Elohim and Jehovah co-creating the world. And that's coming out of a restoration revelation about John chapter 1. And at the same time that we're learning about the Word, we're also getting images of light. And that interplay of Word and light is going to be very important as we make our way through John. And then you get into verses 4 through 5. 4 through 5, I'm translating it here. In him, in this Word, was life, and the life was the light of humankind, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not katalambano it. And katalambano is the Greek word here. And what's important about it is that for King James, it's comprehendeth it not, but then we're not quite sure, what does comprehendeth mean? Does it mean doesn't understand it, or does it mean unable to destroy it? The word itself can mean apprehend, which can mean with your mind, apprehend, I understand it, but it can also mean apprehend in the sense of grab something, capture it. It can also mean control, it can mean comprehend in the sense of understand, like apprehend. And when it comes to fire, it can mean extinguish it, like covering it up, like with when you put your wet fingers over a candle, you are katalambano in some regards, that flame. So there's an unclarity here that's pretty exciting for a prophetic encounter with it, because it can be simple understanding, but it can also be destruction. And Tom Wright, an Anglican priest and theologian and Bible scholar that I really like and admire, and sort of want to adopt into the LDS fold along with C.S. Lewis, he makes the argument that this is a reference to Easter, that on Easter it became clear that the darkness, the evil forces of Pontius Pilate and Herod and the Sanhedrin and the hateful crowd and the demons of the earth, that they had all massed together to destroy Jesus on the cross at Calvary. And on Easter, a light shines again, and it becomes clear that they had failed in their task. And I like that resonance, and I want to dwell with that as we're thinking more about these questions of light in John and in the restoration revelations of it. But the thing that's important to remember is that the Word is light. It's very clear from the prologue of John. The Word is light, and there's an interaction between light and darkness, and the life that is brought by the light and the possibility of death behind it. And then in verse 9, still in the prologue, the King James has it, the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Most people think the syntax of the Greek follows what we've got here, which is the true light. That's the to phos to alethinon. The true light, which lights every person, is entering the cosmos, is entering the world or the universe. So again, the Word is the light, and the light enters the world enters cosmos. It's important that John ties this to Jesus, to the person of Jesus. And in fact says that all those stories you've heard about divine light, all the stories you've heard about Memra Yahweh, the stories you've heard about wisdom, divine wisdom, those are stories about Jesus. That seems to be what John is getting at. And I think there's something missing from John's account that Joseph Smith is then able to bring about. And for the rest of the talk, we'll be thinking together about Joseph Smith's interaction with this Prologue of John. And I believe pretty strongly that Joseph Smith was translating the Prologue of John through these revelations. And for that notion of translation as a connection with an ancient prophet that brings that prophet's writings into new life in our day, I wrote about that in an academic book that came out in the middle of the pandemic called Joseph Smith's Translation. So if you want all the nitty gritty, that's where that is. But fundamentally what's happening is that Joseph Smith in 1832 and 33 translates the Prologue of John in a revelatory manner that's really impressive. And he's grappling with questions about God and Jesus and the moral order of the universe. How do they interact? What does it mean for light to extend from the presence of God? How will the world be transformed? What will it mean for us to have been bearers of that light, to be, as Tom Wright talks about it, bearers of the image of God in the world? How will that take place and what will it amount to? And then still he's asking this question about this true light that John talks about. What is that true light? Who is that true light? And is it both a who and a what? And I think that's part of the question that Joseph Smith is asking. We do have to pause for a second about Plato and Platonism because this is going to come up. Nobody actually is really all that clear about what Plato and Platonism really are. There are lots of dialogues written by Plato, and they don't always tell the same story. There's a lot of concern about what's the true voice of Plato or not. And then Platonism's the whole next step. That's people who affirmed Plato as a source of wisdom and truth, and then tried to implement Plato's philosophy into their own theological and philosophical systems. I think what's most important about Plato for our purposes is the idea that there is a kind of both separation and connection between the ideal and the real, between the notion of a circle, the perfect notion of a circle, and every attempt we make in life to have a circle actually occur. So there are real or observable or earthly or terrestrial circles, all of which are imperfect. But then there's the notion of a circle that we intuitively understand, even though we've never actually seen a perfect circle. And so that's the ideal and the real. And that people talk about Plato's forms and how there's a perfect goodness or a perfect justice that exists in this world of the forms, sort of like our heaven probably, or a perfect human, and maybe that's God. A lot of the details aren't entirely clear, but basically there's a notion that there's the perfect and the imperfect, the ideal and the real, the divine and the mortal, the general and the particular, the universal or general and the particular, the notion of a human, and then this individual human. There's that idea that that both of these are real. And then the question is, how separate are they and how do they maintain their connection? And in Platonism especially, there's a notion of emanation or light that is able to span the difference between the distance between the perfect and the imperfect, or the real and the ideal. And now, as Plato interacts with the Restoration, it's an interesting question. For a long time, the Latter-day Saints thought they were anti-Platonists. And I remember growing up in and around the church in the 80s and 90s, and I guess 70s too. I'm getting a little tiny bit older. And that was sort of the story. If you were a Latter-day Saint, a Mormon back then you knew that Plato was a hot mess that had destroyed Christianity and we had nothing to do with it. But what's interesting is, and there are several scholars that have been doing some work to try to think about this a little more clearly. It turns out there are actually aspects of Plato's thoughts that seem deeply true in the Restoration Gospel, and there are some that seem like they're off base. So I'm not trying to say that Latter-day Saints are pure Platonists, but at a minimum, we've come up with some ideas that resonate with Platonic ideas. And one of those is the idea that matter is never created. That's classic Plato, that's classic Restoration. And one thing we haven't done as well is that second bullet point down there, that this notion that divinity might be more than just personal, but also able to connect back into the personal. And we're going to talk about that in a second. And then this power and significance of light or other aspects. There are other similarities to Platonism and Plato's teachings, and they're a little more tenuous, but there are people that are thinking about these, and it's an interesting area to be thinking through. But with that background, so aware of what the Prologue of John is doing, aware of this notion in Plato that there's the ideal and the real, or the universal and the particular, or the perfect and the imperfect, and there's got to be a way to connect them. You'll be hearing resonances of Jesus as the mediator, absolutely, and his atonement is hugely central in this mediation of the perfect and the imperfect. But it turns out there's a little more going on with Jesus and with atonement than I think we've historically understood. And now we're getting into the meat of the revelations that we're going to be working through. Section 76, which was called the vision, section 84, which contains the oath of the priesthood, section 88, which was called the olive leaf, and section 93, which I believe should be called the true light. D&C 76, the vision, it's February 32. Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith are working on the new translation of the Bible, and they're grappling with the afterlife and many mansions in the afterlife, and this gorgeous and just bristling with energy and insight revelation comes to us. And now we tend to remember it in terms of the three kingdoms or the tiered heaven, but we forget that the degrees of glory that we now talk about are explicitly tied to the light of celestial bodies. And the highest of all these beings, who, again, going back to Genesis 1 through 3, is where light gets introduced into cosmos as a result of God creating heaven and earth in that first verse of Genesis. Calling back to that, what we have in these kingdoms are the degrees of glory. Is the highest of all is God, whose glory is that of the sun. Celestial, terrestrial, telestial are tied to the light cast by celestial bodies. Then in 1832, section 84, that comes a little bit later, it's a temple and priesthood prophecy that's going on. And in that setting, we return back to truth and light. And the Spirit giveth light to every man that cometh into the world, and the Spirit enlighteneth every man through the world. So we're already back to John chapter 1, and we're making a mounting prophetic case that John chapter 1 is going to be the key to understanding light and restoration, and spirit and light and truth are a kind of set of synonyms. And then we get to the olive leaf, which is at the end of 1832 to 33, of sort of what we might call Christmas break, from 32 into 33. The School of the Prophets and Elders, which is meant to be a Latter-day Saint seminary that will be tied to the temple in an important way. It's preparing them for the temple. It's preparing them to go teach the gospel to the world. And as it begins to think through what's going to happen to these participants in the missionary work, there's a second comforter that's going to be the glory of the celestial kingdom. There's the possibility of coming to heaven that's mediated by Jesus, the great mediator. And Jesus is in all and through all things, the light of truth. Still with John, the light that emanates from God not so unlike the Platonic emanations, is the light of truth, and that's Jesus. That Jesus is a force as well as a person. It seems like that's what's happening in the olive leaf. But then it moves on and it talks about the light of Christ being in the sun, and the light of the sun and the power thereof by which it was made. So again, we're going back to John 1, we're going back to Genesis 1, and we're putting Jesus right there. And in this sense, this is a crucial temple text. Now remember, this was a temple text. It was intentionally a temple text. That's what it was for. It was preparing for Kirtland to begin. And the light that shines, which gives you light, comes through him who enlighteneth your eyes. Again, that's Jesus. And it's the same light that quickeneth your understandings. And in this revelation, we then get the addition of this notion of the human conscience that's coming from the light of Christ. But we also get those classic Platonic images that light proceedeth forth from the presence of God to fill the immensity of space. It's that light which is in all things, which giveth life to all things. It's the law. Here again, that notion of a moral order by which all things are governed. And then the power of God who sitteth upon his throne. That's that priesthood of cosmos. That's the capacity to participate available to women and men alike in the regeneration of the world and in the drawing together of heaven and earth. And all of those images of the divine light, of the light of Christ, are really coming into their own in section 88, the olive leaf. And we'll skip that slide in the interest of time. And then there's a moment in the olive leaf where Joseph Smith says, quote, says that the stars, quote, give their light as they roll upon their wings in their glory in the midst of the power of God. And I love that idea of divine power. That sounds like metaphysics, and light, that sounds like physics, coming together in the bosom of God. And remember that notion of stitching together heaven and earth, of allowing them to come together, of allowing light and priesthood to coexist and to mutually enrich each other is critical to that notion of the light of Christ. And then Jesus interrupts. It's something not like Jesus ever interrupts. You're always glad to see Jesus. But Jesus then says that you've seen me, you've seen that I am, and I'm the true light that is in you. And quote, if your eye be single to my glory, your whole body shall be filled with light, and there shall be no darkness in you. And that body which is filled with light comprehendeth all things. So now we see that move from the general to the particular. There's a light that is a power that keeps the world alive and that makes everything possible. And that light can come inside an individual. We can become a candle capable of carrying that flame. And when that happens, we will understand perfectly. So that's the olive leaf, which is so rich and incredible and really is worth reading again and again. And then just a few months later, we get section 93, which I think should be called the true light. And that's where Joseph Smith really brings together these, about 3 years of reading and translating and re-revealing and interacting with John and amplifying this prologue to John. And I think that Joseph Smith is saying that John made a subtle mistake, that John understood that Jesus and this light were identical in every respect. And Joseph Smith is so often in the Restoration suggested that, of course, Jesus is the most pure vessel, and of course, Jesus is the centerpiece of the plan of salvation. It's also true that Jesus calls all of us to be as Jesus, and that there is a sense in which that power, that force, that essence is distinct from Jesus and available to us in that distinction. And I think in the interest of time, I'll skip that slide. The slide should be available for you, but it's sort of entering into the true light revelation. And then the money quote here, which we all know and love: intelligence or the light of truth was not created or made, and the glory of God is intelligence. or in other words, light and truth. And again, this is taking that democratization, that bringing of this light and of Jesus and what Jesus is about into us, because intelligence, what's intelligence? That's the primordial essence that becomes a human being. And it's our participation. So again, at the same time that John is trying to talk about heaven and earth being created by the logos or the true light, whereas Genesis 1 just says God, in the True Light Revelation, section 93 now, we're seeing human beings, men and women together, participating in this. And there's a sense in which this stitching together heaven and earth is not just heaven and earth, it's also stitching together all of us into the great human family. And those are the revelations. They clearly are deeply true to John 1. They're clearly deeply true to Genesis 1 through 3. They clearly indicate that what people have associated with Platonic teaching is ancient and present in restoration theology. They seem to me to indicate that God and Jesus and this essence, force, or power are complementary to each other in much the way that metaphysics and physics are complementary to each other. And they indicate a role for women and men, mere mortals, to participate in this power of light and creation and transformation. And I think you can't read John without reading the True Light Revelations, because there are truths added in these revelations to the original of John that are necessary. And, you know, we think about the restoration as restoring things that are totally lost, but it's also restoring things that have been right in front of us all along. And I think this translation of the Prologue of John that we see extending across these True Light Revelations in the early 1830s is really an example of that restoration process that happens, and that we're called to do when we encounter Scripture as individuals, as a community, and together with the prophets, living and dead, who have helped to shape our thinking here. It's really a dynamic and exciting process to participate in. And then just quickly, and the slides will be available to you to peruse at your leisure, I'm sure. Just quickly, I'm going to pop through a few of the afterlives of this doctrine and then close and be ready for questions. One component of it is the lectures on faith. There, it looks like faith is another way of talking about this light or power of Christ. And I really recommend getting back into the lectures on faith, especially the first one, but about all of them have really interesting material in them, and think about them from the perspective of the true light of Christ. The second notion is the teaching of the second comforter, which is pretty complex, and I need to flag this has historically led some people to charismatic apostasies, and I think that's a misreading of this. And I really do believe that this teaching is true, and it's also not something that should be sending you off into these sort of charismatic apostate groups. But there is a notion that to be true to the revelation of John, that second extra comforter is the personal ministry of Jesus. It's a sacred and interesting doctrine that is related to the true light. And then the temple priesthood. And I think, you know, as we work to figure out how to communicate the fundamentals of the gospel in a very unstable and in many respects unique cultural environment, I think it is worth being deeply true to the gospel as we seek to honor and respect the people we're talking with about these complicated questions that have become painful to a lot of people. And some of that pain is pain that has been buried for a long time and was always sort of present. And some of it's new and specific to our particular cultural moment. But we ought to be able to reach, to draw water from the restoration well, to share its nourishing sustenance with others. And I think the temple priesthood really is one. And the temple priesthood, as an expression of, or an embodiment of, or a synonym for the true light, really is a critical part of restoration theology. And in the temple, it becomes clear that that power of God, that ability to stitch heaven and earth together, the renewal of cosmos that comes as we hear the call of priesthood, comes to both men and women alike. That parenthood and love and attention and ministry are that priesthood. And it exists in a kind of parallel with the priesthood that is used to run the administrative functions of the church, and is a wonderful complement to it, shared again by women and men alike, and with, I think, a new resonance and a new set of implications when understood in the context of the true light priesthood. And then I think I'll wrap up, given the constraints of time. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you well.